All right, we are reading Destined to Live, and I am starting at the top of page 36. As we dressed our dolls in new dresses, one of their neighbors stopped by. She was busy talking with Mrs. Zosha, but kept turning her head to look at us. Then she came over and asked Kathy to introduce me. "Who's this?" she asked. "Is she a good friend of yours?" "Oh," said Kathy. "I've actually never met her before. She's the daughter of someone my mother used to work with. Her name is Luncia." The neighbor stuck out a hand to introduce herself. "Nice to meet you," she said, and I stuck out my hand and gave a slight nod. I was too afraid to say anything that would reveal who I was and why I was there, so I just nodded politely. Early the next morning, Mrs. Zosha took me back to my parents' house. "I'm sorry," she told my mother, but my neighbor said that Lucia looked really sad, and then asked if she was a Jewish girl. I had to lie and tell her no, that she was just shy and was just getting over a cold and wasn't her normal, perky self. But I can't do this favor again. I'm afraid to get reported. "I'm sorry that happened," my mother said, thanking her for taking me in. Luckily, the Azia had already ended. About 2 weeks later, the worst news of all came. All Jews were ordered to leave their homes and move into their ghetto. The ghetto was a small, run-down area just outside the city. It was surrounded by a tall fence and guarded by Nazi soldiers. No one was allowed to leave the ghetto unless the Nazis decided they could. Tatu and our next-door neighbor left right away to go find us a place to live inside the ghetto. Even though we were devastated that we'd have to move there, my parents knew that if they didn't find us a place, we'd have to live on the streets. Tatu came home later that night, relieved to have found us a small room in a tiny 2-room house. "What does it look like?" my mother and I asked him at almost the same time. He barely had taken his coat off his coat. "Well, it really isn't much," Tatu told us. "It's very small, and we're going to be sleeping in an even tighter space than we have now. The toilet isn't indoors. It's outside, in the back. And so it's called an outhouse. We're really going to have to pare down our possessions to the basic essentials. We won't have room for anything extra." We left the ghetto 2 days later. All we took with us were 3 folding cots, a small table, and some clothing. I wasn't allowed to bring any of my toys, even my favorite doll with her white carriage. I cried about it from the minute I woke up until afternoon, but when Uncle Hirsch came barging through our door and into the kitchen just as Tatu was putting all our things into a wheelbarrow, I stopped crying. He stammered. Something terrible happened," Uncle Hirsch said. He looked disheveled, and his hair was stringy and greasy. Sit, my mother said. "What is it?" she asked. "Is everyone okay?" Tatu added. "No, it's terrible," my uncle began. "Earlier today, the Nazis came to the apartment and ordered us, just me and Clara, downstairs to one of the waiting trucks. Clara was crying and grabbed Francia and Ben and wouldn't let go of them, but the soldier pried them out of her arms. Then he grabbed 2 of us by the clothes on our backs and marched us downstairs and shoved us into a truck with other adults." His voice trailed off, and he started crying again. Tatu put a hand on his shoulder. Then Uncle Hirsch composed himself and continued. "I could still hear the kids' voices yelling and crying after us upstairs, even from the street," he said. "It was awful to just leave them like that. The truck drove us out of town and into the woods and stopped at the side of the road. Everyone was told to get out and run in single file toward a clearing in the distance. When it was my turn to run, Clara, who was standing behind me, said, 'Don't run. Another minute to live.' But as I moved forward, I noticed some bushes on the side of the road, and instead of running to the clearing, I ran toward them. I managed to not get shot, but Clara," his voice trailed off again, and he started to sob uncontrollably. Then the rest of us started to cry, too. We tried to console him and think of the right things to say, but nothing seemed right. "Go home and be with the children," Tattoo said to his brother. "They need you right now. You just lost a wife, but they just lost their mother. You're all they've got. We'll meet up together once we all get to the ghetto." Uncle Hirsch nodded, and we walked out of the apartment together. Tattoo suddenly remembered one thing that he didn't want to leave behind. There was a box covered with a green and white printed paper that held all our family's photographs. He went back in to grab it. Then he gently closed the door, and we were on our way. We walked to the ghetto with other families, many of whom we knew and talked with along the way. I was leaving my whole world behind, the only place I ever lived. Would I see it again? I said goodbye to every house and every street we passed, and tried to burn an image of all of my favorite places into my mind. I breathed in deeply when we passed the bakery and the pastry shop. Looking at my parents' faces and seeing how they fixed their eyes on things longer than usual, I knew that they were doing the same. After walking for 1 hour and becoming exhausted, we reached the ghetto. Compared to the lively streets and well-kept houses in Lvov, the ghetto looked dingy and gray. People were sitting on the sidewalks, and mothers with crying children latched onto them begged for food. There were stray cats and dogs everywhere, adding to the chaos. The air had an acidic smell, like a mix of chemicals and urine. "I want to go home," I said to my mother. "It's awful here." "I'm afraid this is home for now," my mother said. "You're right, it is awful. No human being should have to live in these conditions." Finally, we found the tiny house. It was painted white, but the paint was badly chipped. 3 steps in front led to a small porch. The door made a loud thwop when it closed behind us. Our room was even smaller than the kitchen in our old apartment. In the back was a window, and through it I could see the outhouse. We dropped our things in the corner. It was getting dark, and so Tattoo started opening up our cots. There was barely room to walk around them. "It's so small," I said to my mother. "I'm a small girl, and I can't even walk around the beds without bumping my knees. I'll have bruises all over them all the time." "Let's go for a walk," my mother said. "We can leave Tattoo here to set things up, and when we come back, it'll look better than it does now." We went outside and walked around the back of the house, and my mother pointed out a huge barn in the far end of the backyard. There was a lot of movement going on inside, and then I realized that it was filled with people's living spaces on the ground and in the hayloft. I thought about how animals had lived there, and now these people were living like animals. "See," my mother said, "no matter how bad you think you have it, there's always someone who has it worse. Don't you feel sorry for them?" I nodded my head. It made me feel lucky to at least have our little room. When I went back inside, our neighbors had arrived. "Nice to meet you," all of the adults said to one another, shaking hands. There were 4 people in their family, so we were 7 altogether. The only other child was a boy named Sunio. He was quite a bit younger than me, and so I felt like it was my duty, as the older girl, to initiate a hello. I gave a little wave, but he ran and hid himself behind his mother's skirts. I had a feeling he wouldn't be much of a playmate. Uncle Hirsch, Francia, Benny, and our grandma were lucky enough to find some place to stay too. They lived in a small attic of a house a few streets away, and I'd go visit them whenever I could. There were 4 long flights of rickety stairs to climb, and when I got to the top, it took It took me a little while before I could have a conversation with anyone, because I had to catch my breath. My favorite thing to do there was to look at pictures. Grandma would give photographs from our family in America, and she'd always make sure to point everyone out to me. I was only allowed to hold them with clean hands, and so the first thing I had to do when I got to the attic was wash them. Be careful not to put your fingers on the pictures, she would say. You have to hold them by the edges, like this, and she'd show me the proper way to do it. Who's this tall man with the beard? I'd ask her. What about this girl in the lovely dress? Or, where are they in this picture? These were my usual questions. The photos were of my cousins Izzy, Leon, and Helen, and my Uncle Joseph. There was also Cousin David, Uncle Abe, and Aunt Ida, and Uncle Benny, and Aunt Rebecca, who all lived in New York. In the ghetto, hunger was our daily companion. The little bit of bread that my mother was able to buy with the coupons that the Germans allotted to the Jews was made partially from sawdust. We didn't mind its horrible taste, if only the rations were a little bigger. Whoever had a little money and was able to sneak out of the ghetto bought food on the outside and brought it into the ghetto in their pockets. It was primarily bread. One street was unofficially designated as the Black Market. I can still hear it in my mind, the voices of the few sellers of bread calling out, "Who wants a whole? Who wants a half? Who wants a quarter loaf of bread?" As a rule, the Germans wouldn't come into the ghetto to take away any Jewish people if it wasn't the day of an Azia. However, some uniformed Germans would stroll into the ghetto just to sightsee. On such occasions, when one spotted a German, he or she would say the words "Sheksh" in a loud whisper. People would pass the word around, and in a few minutes the street would become totally empty. Sechs means the number 6 in German. I really don't know why this is the word was used as a warning. Even though all of the Jews in Lvov now lived in the ghetto, they were still Axias. Tatu and Sinyo's father would stay up late at the night and talk about the best place for us to hide. Finally, they decided that it would be under the porch. Tatu cut a hole in the back of the credenza and moved it in front of our entry to our hiding place. To get inside, we'd have to crawl in through the credenza. It took them about a week to dig out a space big enough to fit all 7 of us. A few days after the hiding place was finished, my mother woke me up very early. "Quickly," she said in a hurried whisper. It started earlier than we'd expected. "We all have to hide right now." I pulled on my clothes as fast as I could. It was rumored that this axia was to last for several days. As we started to climb in, my mother noticed Miss Manya, one of our neighbors, standing nearby. Somehow she'd found out about the hiding place. "Can I come in? Is there room for me?" she asked. "I don't have any place else to go. Please," she pleaded. There was barely enough room for the rest of us, but the adults decided they couldn't turn her away. We squeezed together so tightly that we could hardly breathe. It was very hot in there, so I thought it strange that Miss Manya had her coat over her shoulders. Soon we heard heavy footsteps above us. It reminded me of the last time I hid with Hemio. I almost started to cry, but I decided I needed to set an example for Sinyo, so I bit my lip and held back my tears. After a while, the Nazis left, probably thinking that we'd already been taken. Once it was dark outside, we silently snuck back into the room. The next morning we returned to our little cave, because we were basically hiding outside. We could easily hear what was going on in the street. We heard the trucks idling at the curb. and people's cries as the Nazis put them inside the trucks. All of a sudden, we heard two familiar voices. They belonged to Francia and Ben. "Uncle! Aunt! Luncia!" they cried. When my mother saw that I was about to call out after them, she covered my mouth with her hand and whispered in my ear, "We can't, Luncia. We can't have them. It's impossible. There just isn't enough room." Soon the sound of their voices faded. Tears started streaming down my face at the thought of my cousins being taken away. I remembered something that had happened with Benny a few days ago. While I was visiting my cousin, he motioned to follow him into the corner of the room and said that he wanted my advice on something important. Straightening out my skinny body and looking at me with eyes that were wise beyond his 12 years, Benny said, "My dad gave me a few coins. I have a choice. I can either buy a cookie, which is delicious, or an egg, which is very healthy. What should I do?" I was very proud to be asked such a question by my very smart cousin. Not really waiting for my answer, Benny said, "I want to live and be healthy, so I will buy an egg." I couldn't believe he would soon die. My mother put her other palm on my forehead, stroking it and rocking me to try to calm me down. Finally, I was calm enough, and she removed her hand from my mouth. "How could this be happening?" I whispered to her. I shook my head back and forth and almost started to cry again. "What if our family gets taken? What will we do?" My mother looked as if she was feeling exactly like I was. "I don't know, Lucia. We won't know anything until morning, so for now, try to get some sleep." The Axia continued late into the night, and so we didn't leave the hiding place to go back to our room. In the morning it was over. As we crawled out, we discovered why Miss Manya had her long coat with her. It was to hide her little dog. Had the dog started to bark or whine, we might have been found. Tattoo was the most upset of all. "How could you have done that? Risking all of our lives with that dog," he screamed. "What if he had barked? Dogs bark. They don't know any better." "Then we all would have been dead, and we took you in, even though there wasn't room to begin with." All Miss Manya could do was look at her feet. "I'm sorry," she said. "I love this dog like a child. I couldn't just leave him in the street." Tattoo shook his head and walked away in disgust. It was hard for me not to think that if we hadn't let her in, there would still have been enough room for my cousins. I became so angry, I nearly screamed at her as well. We hadn't survived another Axia and escaped death yet again, but I feared the same wasn't true for the rest of our family. The moment we crawled out of that hole, we hurried to check up on Grandma, Uncle Hirsch, and my cousins. I ran ahead of my parents, and they were a minute or two behind. By the time I got to the top of the attic steps, I was even more out of breath than usual. "Oh no, no!" I screamed when I got to the top. The room was empty. I ran back downstairs, tears streaming, and I got to the bottom just as my parents arrived. "It's empty! Mother, Tattoo, they're gone! Gone! There's no one there!" The three of us huddled together and wept. A man who lived in the room next to our relatives came out when he heard us crying. Through a crack in the door of a closet he'd been hiding in, he had seen the whole family being taken away. We walked back to our little room with our hearts heavy. Now it was just the three of us. "We're alone," Tattoo said. "But I suppose, even in our sadness, we need to be thankful for what we do have, which is one another." My mother and I nodded in agreement. It was true. As far as we knew, the only family we had left lived in America. No one but people lucky enough to have a job on the outside were allowed to leave the ghetto. Tattoo was one of them, and so was Sinyo's father. Every morning, just as the sun was coming up, they would stand in line with the other men who had useful Jew ID cards, waiting for the guards to wave them through the ghetto's gate. After we'd been living in the ghetto for about 3 months, I overheard Tatu telling my mother and the other adults a story after he came home from work one evening. I ran into Mrs. Ezekiel this morning, he began. The Ezekiel family had been friends with my parents since I was a baby and had been loyal customers of our store. Serotinia. She told me how glad she was to see me alive, my father continued. Then she hugged me and said, Isaac, you and Barbara will probably not survive the war. Let me take Luncia. I'll raise her as my daughter. I gasped when I heard this. How could my parents consider giving me to someone else? We should be together. How could this possibly be the best thing for me? When my mother heard this, she started to cry. I wasn't sure if she was crying because she was sad to be separated from me, or if she was happy that I had a place to go. Maybe it was both. How would we even get Luncia out of the ghetto? She asked Tatu. I don't know, Tatu said. Then he told her the story of what had happened before he ran into Mrs. Ezekiel. It was still dark outside, and it was very cold. As he got near the gate, he noticed that the men walking in front of him were shivering. When the guard asked the man for his ID card, the man reached into his pocket to get it out, but because he was so cold, his hand was shaking, and he couldn't get it out quickly. The guard had no patience. Shoot him, he said to the other guard. My father heard the shot and saw the man fall in front of him. See if he has his card, just for the fun of it. The guard reached into the man's pocket and pulled out the card. Well, the guard said, that man had no luck. I saw a man killed when I was standing in line last week, Sunyo's father said. He said he had just gotten there when we saw a guard yelling at a man near the gate. The guard yelled, Jew, to the 2 guard dogs that always sat there, and they attacked and killed the man. After hearing these 2 stories, I was terrified by the idea of having to be smuggled past the guards and their dogs. But my parents were intent on getting me out so I could live with the Ezekiels. The next morning, my mother dressed me in dark clothing that would blend in with Tatu's dark gray coat. Mother, what if this doesn't work? I asked her in a million different ways. I had tons of what-if questions that morning that I kept rattling off one after another, but all she kept saying to me was, you have to believe, Luncia. You have to believe that you will live. That's the only thing you can do. Mother told me to hold on tight to Tatu's leg. I wrapped myself around him. Tatu slipped on his big coat, and my mother told Sunyo's father to walk closely next to Tatu to help keep me hidden. My mother bent down and kissed me all over my face. Will I ever see you again? She kept saying in between bursts of tears. I didn't know what to say to this. Tatu said that we needed to leave quickly, and then we were on our way.